Tervetuloa kriittisen ajattelun aamukahveille. Tämä video on osa Taksvärkki ry:n tuottamaa videokeskustelusarjaa. Videoilla paneudutaan eri asiantuntijoiden kanssa siihen, miten media ja koulumaailma vaikuttavat maailmankuvan muodostumiseen, miten pystymme moninaistamaan maailmankuvaamme ja edistämään yhdenvertaisuutta. Tällä videolla käsitellään kulttuuria ja sitä, että mitä se kulttuuri oikeastaan tarkoittaa. Meillä on aiheesta keskustelemassa asiantuntijat Fred Dervin ja Oona Piipponen. So welcome Fred and Oona. It's really exciting to have you here. And if you could just start with a brief introduction. So who are you and what do you do?
Okay, so my name is Fred Dervin. I'm a professor of multicultural education, although I work on intercultural education, but we'll talk about this later. I work at the University of Helsinki, Faculty of Educational Sciences, they call it these days. And and I specialize in intercultural issues, mobility, migration, internationalization. And I've been publishing on this stuff in different languages for about 15, 20 years now. And so it's a pleasure to be with you and to get to know Oona and then you, Ida.
So hello to everybody who's watching the video as well. My name is Oona Piipponen and I'm currently finalizing my doctoral research on children's intercultural encountering in primary school. At the University of Eastern Finland. I have a background in primary education as a primary teacher. I look forward to having this discussion.
Thank you. And let's start with the first question. So how would you define culture and culture identity?
Well, I think culture, the difficulty is that it could be defined in so many different ways. I think quite often it's thought of as this kind of static entity, but if you think about it, culture, it was slightly different in your parents' time than in your time, and it's definitely changed, since your grandparents' time. So you notice that actually cultural change happens over time, that's for that reason in my research, I've defined culture as a process that continuously shapes shared meaning systems through interactions.
Okay, and so I would take a different approach to this. I could talk about culture for 1 year without stopping. I mean, I remember when I was actually a doctoral student back in the days, I went to a big conference, I think it was in London, and there were all the big gurus of the field of intercultural education there. And I was sitting there in the audience and everybody came on stage and they were using the word culture and culture and culture and culture all the time. And in those days, I was, of course, very confused by this term. So I raised my hand at the end, a very big guru there, and I said, I'm sorry, sir, but everybody's been using the word culture here and nobody actually explains what they mean by it. So would you mind giving me a definition of the word culture? And this person looked at me in a very condescending way and said, but that's a stupid question. It's too complex. We cannot define culture. And everybody clapped at that moment. And I thought, this is so disgusting because these people are using the word culture, but they don't want to define it. So they don't even know what they're doing with it. And ever since that moment, I thought my work is going to be about showing how much of a fraud, in a sense, this concept of culture could be or can be. And so in my work, especially for the past 10 years, first of all, I don't use the concept of culture. And I'm not interested in defining culture because the problem is, it can mean so many different things to so many different people. And then there are two problems, at least, about this concept of culture. Number one, it's a European concept, okay? So it started to be extremely popular. It appeared in research around the 18th century through European modernity. And it's been used for terrible things, You know, scholars, politicians, educators were involved in colonization, for example, and put forward, you know, used this word and also the concept of civilization, which actually we don't use anymore in Europe, but which is used in other parts of the world. I'll tell you about China a little bit later. And it's a problem because it's a remnant actually of a certain period of time in a certain place in the world. And it's a concept that has spread since the 18th century. And for example, if you look at the word, the Chinese word for culture today, wenhua, it's really interesting to notice that in the early 20th century, the word changed meanings in Chinese, influenced by the West. Before the early 20th, so when China and the West started to work together and to clash against each other, actually, if we could say this term, a lot of concepts in China changed meaning. So they were there already, but they had a different orientation. So before the 20th century, the word culture in Chinese, if you take the word wenhua, hua means change, to evolve, to move forward. So culture before this actually referred to something that's changing or something that's being created when two people get together, which interestingly to me is the definition for interculturality. Now, what culture means today in Chinese is what it means or doesn't mean for a lot of Western people, which is basically something that tends to be static, something that tends to be national, something that is there's a scientific term for this, culturalism. So culture as something that is closed in a sense. So this is the first problem in this concept. It's a European concept. You know, before the 18th century, people didn't really use the concept of culture in Europe. Now, the second point is, in some parts of the world, some countries, there are some concepts that you are not allowed to use for political reasons, for societal reasons. So, for example, if I take the concept of race, in a place like Finland, in a place like France, in some other parts of the world, you can't really use this in research or education because it's very taboo. So we talk about racism, but we don't talk about race in a sense. So what we've realized in research is that some decision makers, some educators, but also some researchers, sometimes they would use the word culture as a substitute because it sounds not the same, you know. So in a sense, sometimes we do what we call racism without race by substituting race by culture. And that's, of course, a big problem. Another thing that culture substitutes for some people is money, finance, business, economy, that we don't mention. You know, I've realized, you know, I do a lot of work with the Chinese, and they have a really interesting approach actually to interculturality, multiculturalism in education. And one of the first goals actually of their way of seeing this is the economy, what they call economic development. So what they want through this kind of approach is to give financial opportunities for everybody. Now, what's interesting is that in Finland, for example, but also most European countries, this is never voiced. We talk about social justice, we talk about equality, we talk about culture, but we don't talk about giving the financial, you know, possibilities to everyone. So for these two really problems around the concept of culture, I refuse simply, and I'm sorry if that sounds a bit strong, but I refuse to define it. What I'm interested in actually when I think about culture is to see actually how people use the concept. Educators, researchers, politicians, people on a daily basis. What meaning do they give to culture? What do they do with culture? So for example, when someone says, so I'm entering into a dialogue with someone and they say, oh, I'm sorry, Fred, you can't understand because you are not from my culture, which is quite an interesting argument. Why do people, this is my interest. Why do people use this argument and what do they do with the concept of culture there? So as a scholar, but also as someone who's working with student teachers, I would say, I'm not saying we should avoid the concept of culture. You know, this is not censorship or anything. But number one, we need to bear in mind the 2 points that I've just made. culture can mean other things for people that do not relate to how we usually see culture, whatever. Maybe we need to be more precise in the use of terms. If we talk about art, it is art. If it is about food, it is food. If it is about politics, note how we never mention politics, for example, but a lot of so-called cultural aspects are about politics. If it is about politics, talk about politics. If it is about, men's power in societies, then it is about men's power, and not necessarily that so broad bag of culture. To finish, maybe about this, I could continue, but we need to move on. There's a very interesting concept that I have used and some other people have used also, which is culture as an excuse, and how some discourses of culture actually are used, especially by those who have the power to talk, to explain things further, to explain why people behave in a certain way, why people in a sense are less developed than us, and so on and so forth. There's a great book about this. It's a little bit old already, but it's from 2005. It's called Multiculturalism Without Culture by Anne Phillips, where she problematized this very well, how culture, especially in some parts of the world, will tend to be used as an excuse to treat the other, in a sense. And that's it. I'm sorry that was a bit long, but I wanted to explain clearly why I do not want to define this term in a sense.
Can I just make one small addition as well? That
please do.
I think I think it's fabulous what you've just said, Fred. And it's totally true that when we talk about the word culture, we are actually talking about a lot of different things, and that's why it's so difficult to define. But I do think that we are part of sort of meaning-making systems within certain communities where we share certain understandings, and those can kind of happen within very sort of like micro-level groups, like within the family community, for example, and you can have a family culture within a classroom community. You can have a classroom culture, an organizational culture. So it also ranges from your sort of personal, small scale groups all the way to sort of these large groups like language groups or nationalities, which again is quite a recent development. People a few hundred years ago probably didn't have national identity in the same way that we have right now. So culture, like what I'm trying to say as well is that we're actually not just one culture. We're made up of lots of different cultures. And everybody in that way is that kind of hybrid. You're not purely one thing or another, but you're a mix of all the things that you've come across or that those communities you've been part of, and you've learned to sort of take on their ways of expressing themselves. And maybe this is kind of a good bridge to move on to this idea of cultural identity. Again, I think like if when thinking about cultural communities as you belong to many, that also makes your identity pluralistic. So you're not just Finnish, or you're not just from this particular class or this particular religion and so forth. You're actually pluralistic. You're made up of all of those different things. And I think it shows in the way that you can subtly change your behaviors depending on who you're interacting with. You have these kind of this innate knowledge that automatically shifts your behavior so that you're in connection with those people who you associate with. And another thing that I wanted to add, which I think is quite relevant to what you were saying earlier, is that quite often when you're part of a majority culture, particularly now that we have these kind of nation states and national cultures, when you're part of the majority culture in an area, you tend to see your own culture as neutral or normal. And in a way, you might not even think of it as culture. Whereas the minority groups you define through culture, which is what you were saying, this kind of a sort of politically correct way to talk about race, for example. They're viewed as cultural based on their language or ethnicity or religion and so forth. And then the other aspect is also this aspect of time. So you're not born into a culture or an identity that stays stable and the same throughout your whole life, but actually your cultural identities connect you to these different groups of people at different points in your life. And some communities you can kind of opt in, you can choose to belong to those communities. Others you kind of inherit, through, for example, your home language is something that you learn from your parents or your family culture, for example. And I think, once children grow up, they realize for the first time, actually, not all families were the same as mine. Not all schools were the same as mine. You suddenly realize, that your way was not normal. It was just one in many. So I think that cultural identity should also be defined as kind of cumulative over your lifetime.
Some excellent point there, Oona. Maybe just a few comments on the interesting points you were making. Of course, as a thinker, I have some issues with the idea of community because, there are many communities we cannot enter. There are communities we are forced to be part of that we don't want to be part of, and we pretend. And even the small communities sometimes, you've experienced that as well, that you are part of a small group, but you don't like the people, or you don't want to be part of that thing, but you're there, but it's not part of you, it's not part of your identity. So that's a term I keep hearing more and more, the community. And like culture, I sometimes I have some problems because, of course, what's the border between the communities? I think it's impossible to define. That's probably what you were hinting at. But at the same time, we tend to use the word community, maybe in English, not always to refer to those who are in the majority. I mean, it's, what you were saying about majority culture and minority culture, although I wouldn't use these terms because I think they very much connote it. But what's interesting, again, in the use of the word culture is that, yeah, you're right. We would tend maybe to use this word culture to refer to the other, while when we refer to us, we would use terms like society, something that is constructed as being more serious, more stable, more, stronger in a sense. So yeah, of course, I agree very much with all the things that you are saying, of course, bearing in mind power. Yeah, because power is part of this game also. But I haven't spoken about cultural identity yet. You know what I've written on my notebook? I don't want to use this concept because some scholars and educators, they talk about cultural identity, and then some will talk about linguistic identity, and some will talk about national identity, and some will talk about ethnic identity, and some will talk about, so it's like a different kind of identity, different kinds of identities. And I always wonder, what's the difference, for example, between cultural and linguistic identity? I mean, these go hand in hand, so really I used the concept of identity very much in my way. I don't use it anymore, but I think it's enough sometimes just to talk about identity or identification, which is about what everybody does. Now, we are doing identity now. We are communicating together. I'm looking at you, I'm nodding, sometimes I'm writing. So all of this creates who we think we are for ourselves, but also we create each other at the same time. I'm a professor, Oona is a doctoral student. Unfortunately, that creates some hierarchy that for me, it means absolutely nothing. But for some people, for example, Ida, you started with me because I don't know why you started with me, but some people might think, oh, it's the male professor. So of course we start with him. And then Oona is the doctoral student. So we do this all, I'm not saying this is why, but I'm just trying to explain to our people so they think. So this process of identification, be cultural language, we use all these kinds of things, to do things together, to adapt, to suffer, to reject, to lie, to, I mean, so in a sense, I believe increasingly that I have an identity, but my identity is you. And your identity is me. And what we do together with power differentials is this identification. But I wouldn't label it as cultural or linguistics or linguistic whatever, because I find it very difficult to define the borders or the boundaries between this. I think that in research, these are today marketing tools, you know, especially because a lot of us are writing books and we are writing articles. We need labels in a sense, and sometimes we put labels to make a difference. So that's all I wanted to say about this.
Yeah, can I shortly just comment?
Please, of course.
I really did like the idea that identity is something that we do in the moment. That it's something that we recreate every time in our interactions, because, like you say, you know, our identity is dependent on who we're interacting with. We don't have to perform for ourselves in a way. We only have to perform for other people.
Yes.
You know? So that was a good point.
Exactly. I mean, identity is performance, actually. But you know, and the problem about this idea of identity is, you know, I prefer the Chinese word for identity. The English word, or the word that we use in Indo-European languages, is the wrong term, because identity comes from the Latin idem et idem, which means the same and the same. But identity is definitely not the same and the same. It's just playing around the words. But I think it's always interesting to look at the origins of words. I think they tell us, you know, quite a lot about you know, how we've conceptualized them throughout history.
Thank you both so much. This is a very interesting discussion and quite thought-provoking. Maybe next we can move to the more practical matters. So based on your research and experience, what kind of challenges are there in the Finnish education system when it comes to multiculturality? And on the other hand, what kind of successes are there?
Now, the first thing that I'd like to say about this topic is that we must always bear in mind that teachers always try to do their best, that teachers are the products of how they have been trained, even been trained to be autonomous teachers, to make decisions about how they are teaching. Ida, you mentioned you are from Oulu. Oona, you are from, it was Joensuu, and I'm from Helsinki. If you look at, for example, the curricula, you know, in terms of how teachers are trained for multicultural, intercultural, global, whatever term you want to use, you will see some overlaps, but you will see a lot of ideological differences, because it depends on the people who are determining what should be taught and how it should be taught. This is what we call academic freedom. This is the richness that I would say, or the luck that we have in Finland, that, you know, nobody in a sense is telling us what and how we should teach, because we should use our research. So I think we are so blessed by this. But of course, because in some other countries, they have no choice. There's one ideology and you have to follow what they tell you to teach to future teachers. Of course, that's something positive, but on the other hand, it means that we do have, of course, some challenges. And one of the challenges is the ideological ocean around multiculturalism, intercultural and global issues, and whatever term you want to use. It's positive because we can talk, we can discuss, we can debate, but the problem, what's happening for teachers on the spot when they are teaching, is that they have no real opportunity to really talk about this. So some of them would have been trained, would have taken some courses as part of their initial teacher training, teacher education, but maybe also some professional development courses. But the problem is it's not always coherent, and it doesn't always give long-term skills for thinking and rethinking about interculturality. As I said, I've been involved in this stuff for about 20 years. I think that every second year, I have changed my way of thinking about interculturality through the people that I've met, through the mistakes that I've made in the publication. You know, when I read my first articles, or even recently someone asked me to reread one of the articles I published 3 years ago, I nearly vomited. I thought, but this is disgusting. it's very clearly my political ideologies that are there that I'm trying to push, because that's what we do. Multicultural, intercultural is political. It's apoliticized politics in a sense. So I think what's missing maybe for teachers, either in terms of initial teacher education or professional development, is to help them to map out the range of ideologies that are available in our society through our politicians, through the EU, through the PISA OECD thing, for example, but also through research, so that they have like a broad range of ideas about what's going on. How is this person defining and understanding interculturality or whatever? How is this person doing this? So then they can make a decision themselves about, this is how I want to treat my kids. This is how I want to teach about this. At the moment, if you're trained in Oulu, in Joensuu, or in Helsinki, or if you're not trained at all, maybe the decisions that you make in the classroom about, treating a kid in a certain way, teaching something in a certain way, can be completely different. When people ask me about Finnish education, I think, and multiculturalism, I want to say multicultural educations, because it's not the same everywhere. I'm not saying it should be the same everywhere, but I feel sometimes that teachers don't have the right tools to make proper decisions. And unfortunately, a lot of scholars like me, if I go back to my previous publications, we blame teachers for making mistakes. And I think that's really unfair. I think that, again, teachers are trying their best, but they are part of this political, economic, scholarly, ideological sphere that they need help with, in a sense. So yeah, I've heard things like, oh, some teachers are racist, some teachers, they don't like foreigners, some teachers, they are not open-minded enough, etc., etc. Yes, who is saying this? How are they judging these people? And are these teachers really trained properly, in a sense? That's a bit of a problem, in a sense. So, but that's all I have to say on this. I might come back after Oona. I'm very eager to hear what she has to say.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the way teachers teach, in a way, reflects what our society is like, and many teachers haven't. If you don't have a specific interest in multiculturalism or interculturalism, not all universities require student teachers to take any courses that would allow them to even graze the surface of this field. So in a sense, what I agree with Fred is saying, that it's a lot is demanded of teachers with very little knowledge about what's actually expected. I mean, we would never send teachers to teach maths, I hope, in a math curriculum without first preparing them with a deep understanding of how mathematics works and what's the appropriate pedagogy for teaching math. But there's somehow this assumption that, our values are enough to see us through as teachers in dealing with these complex issues. And the trouble with school is that it's not this safe haven from society. All the issues of society are also reflected in school. So, if there's racism in society, there's racism in school, and so forth, other forms of discrimination too. And to some extent, and to a large degree, these issues are also structural. So we have learned certain ways of being and certain ways of thinking, and reproduce these ways in our interactions with students. For example, the PISA results on migrant students, they underperform in PISA. And I wouldn't blame the migrant students themselves for being in this situation. They're children, they're young people. You can't blame them for underperforming. The problem is in the school system. I think for me, now I don't want to just talk about problems, but I think it's important to kind of bring up the issues so that then we can make them better through better understanding. I think you can say that there's sort of different forms of multiculturalism, what Fred was saying. you have this kind of conservative discourse, conservative model, where often the multicultural students. So first of all, when we talk about multiculturalism, actually we don't include Finnishness in that. So multicultural is everybody else except the Finns. And it actually already makes this divide between, Finnish students, normality, the correct social skills and so forth. And then you have these multicultural students, not normal, the other problem, because they don't know our Finnish ways of doing things. And then there's this kind of expectation of assimilation. They're in Finland, they have to learn the ways in Finland and so forth. And obviously this is already loaded. And then, but this is like not the idea behind multiculturalism when it was first conceived. Obviously, it wasn't there to create divides. It was actually about, in the United States, it was about changing society so that voices from all kinds of cultural groups or groups, if you don't want to use the word culture, could be heard and could have an influence. And it was about essentially promoting equality, which is of course a very important part of what we perceive as Finnishness. So this is interesting that actually in Finland, the kind of traditional discourses about multiculturalism doesn't really, in my opinion, promote equality, even if there are good intentions behind the thinking that we have to help these children who just don't know our ways. But then the other kind of way that multiculturalism has been approached is this idea of, well, actually, we need to see these students as a resource. We need to celebrate the diversity. There's, this idea that we're all human and, we all share a common humanity, and, really cultural differences are not that big. We have the same heart, at the end of the day. And this approach actually also has problems because, first of all, it doesn't take away the distinction between us and them. It's still us, the normal Finnish, teachers and students, versus the other multicultural students who are this resource, and in a way can also be seen as a slightly kind of an exotic resource. The richness of my life has been substantially increased because I get to benefit from all these different cultures who surround me, and you can see that there's a little bit colonialist as well. And the other side is that the problem is that quite often they're represented through these kind of, the diversity is represented through concrete things that we perceive as cultural. So the food, the festivals, the flags, and so forth. And it's the celebratory approach, which may actually reinforce stereotypes. There's issues with this kind of approach as well, because it doesn't take into consideration the social justice issues that we keep on coming back to. So really, multiculturalism, maybe we shouldn't even use that term. Maybe we should just talk about social justice, like Fred was saying earlier about culture and things. Maybe these are too confusing. We should just focus on like what's actually important in these issues. And obviously, I don't want to paint a too grim a picture. I'm not trying to say that everybody's doing it completely wrong. I think there's probably lots of pockets where really good education is happening, where teachers and other educators are doing a good job, but we're not sharing it, so we don't know where it's happening, if it's happening, and I think that's something that the education system could build up a little bit more, is more this collective knowledge about what are good practices with regard to these issues. And I also want to say, that some NGOs are doing a really lovely job in promoting knowledge.
Thank God they are there.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Oona. I mean, wow, so many wonderful things there. How long do we have left? 3 hours, I hope. I mean, of course, the question about all this is, what is it all about? What are we trying to achieve? You mentioned social justice. I see this word everywhere now. It's actually substituting multiculturalism in many, many, many cases, because people have sort of realized that multiculturalism is a bit like, ooh, taboo, whatever, but social justice sounds good. What is it really about? I don't understand. I'm still not clear about this. Equality, what is equality? What does it mean in a sense? Again, the Chinese, I think, are much more clear about this. It's about financial participation of everybody. Yeah, so it's about money because the world works around money. But we hide all this behind cultural tolerance, respect for culture, etc., etc. Okay, yeah. I'm not quite sure what they mean. So this is the core of the problem. What is this all about? What are you use the word values? What are the real values we are trying to promote? Not empty values that the Finnish Prime Minister is throwing on the table all the time, but what is the core? What's behind all this? In a sense. I mean, so many other things. When you said, maybe some teachers are not interested in multiculturalism. Yeah, I hear this very often. But again, the problem is, why should they be interested if they don't really know what is the point of all of this? Because they are not told. So for them, it's an extra burden. They have so much work and they think, oh my God, they're adding all this stuff and I'm not getting paid more and I have to be more competent. That's terrible. But we don't tell them why it's useful. What are we going to do? Well, number one, who is it that we are talking about? You realize, Oona, you're the first one until now who's used the word of the people that we are talking about indirectly, migrant students. Notice we haven't used this word before because diversity, cultural, blah, 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 all of this refers indirectly in these discussions to migrants. I put migrants because I don't know anymore what is a migrant. I mean, I see a lot of kids who have been born in Finland, who are second, third generation, and they still refer to as migrants. How do you move forward in a society when this concept is thrown in your face all the time? I realized how that word migrant had become a taboo in education when I started in Helsinki, I was part of a Nordic project on education. And the name of the project was Diverse Teachers for Diverse Students. And I remember sitting there in Reykjavik for the first day of the meeting. And I was just listening. I mean, I know it's hard to believe, but I just sat there and listened because I wanted to hear who is it that we were talking about. So we were all around the table, white people, and we were talking about diverse students, diverse teachers, diverse, blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, I just raised my hand and I said, I just couldn't anymore. I raised my hand and I said, who are we talking about here? Because nobody has mentioned something concrete. Silence. And I said, okay, so if we had been here together 10 years ago, the name of the project would have been Migrant Student Teachers for Migrant Teachers, isn't it? And everybody went this. So I think that one of the problems maybe for teachers is, number one, they don't really know what this is all about because it's empty discourse, actually empty but very political discourses about why we should do this. And then we sort of hide the issues behind terms that are so broad that by the end of the day, we don't dare to speak the real, what the real issue is about. My approach to these questions is actually, I do believe that multiculturalism, interculturalism, whatever you want to say, is basically everyone with different power symbols, statuses in our society. Someone will be born elsewhere, rich, poor, whatever, and always ignoring the financial aspects of it all. I think that's a problem because we are not putting the finger on the report, and we know it has an impact in a sense. I'll stop here.
Yeah, and I want to maybe just clarify that when we talk about migrants, we're actually not even talking about all migrants. I teach
That's so true.
at an international school, and when we talk about multiculturalism, we're not actually talking about the students in the international school that I teach who are more well off and their families have come to Finland with a kind of sort of a basically they work in they're middle class, upper middle class, and they have good paying jobs, and they bring in tax money to Finland. So when we talk about migrants, we're not talking about those migrants. We call those migrants expats. We don't call them migrants.
I mean, brilliant thing that you're saying, and I forgot to mention this. Actually, in China, they have the same issue. They use a specific word to refer to internal migrants versus expats. I think what teachers could be taught, or teachers could pay attention to, is how do they talk, and how do people in the school talk about different kinds of people? What are the words? Who is categorized as a migrant? Who is categorized as a Finn? When you mention Finnishness, of course, it's whiteness mostly. I'm white, I'm not Finnish, but I can pass. It's okay, as a Finn in a sense. But if I was like, Amin Kang, to whom you spoke the other day, well, I'm sure he's told a lot of things that has happened to him. So, okay.
And without forgetting also indigenous populations and people like the Roma and so forth as well. They tend to be also lumped into this multiculturalism category sometimes, and quite often they're completely forgotten as well. They're just not mentioned.
Yeah. But bear in mind that also some of these categories, they don't want to be put in the multicultural category. Like indigenous people, for example, they are not part of if you use the word multicultural with them, they're not too happy actually, because their issue is different. So, but you make a good point. It's about, again, borders, how to define and who defines. Yeah, very good.
And how could diverse identities be supported in education?
I think I prefer to talk about pluralistic identities if we have to talk about identities, as we discussed earlier. This idea that actually everybody has a pluralistic identity, and we include everybody in that category, not just some subgroup who we perceive as cultural. And first of all, I think teachers need to realize that it's important not to make assumptions or label students based on their kind of perceived backgrounds. Let the students themselves define their own identity. Also, I think it's important that teachers make the effort to actually get to know their students well, because if you don't know your students, you're much more likely to make assumptions, jump to conclusions. And build trust with them, because who wants to share their identity with someone that you don't trust or you don't relate to? So I think in practice, that means that you have to involve students in the planning of learning. There have to be ways in which they can bring their thoughts, their interests, their experiences into the learning, and draw from their existing, if you want to call them cultural sort of experiences, so that then those identities are being performed also in the classroom, rather than having this kind of separation between, for example, home. I mean, there is always going to be a separation between home and school identity, but that there can be sort of a dialogue going on, that you're bringing in aspects of your other life that's not happening in school, and not just assuming that everybody has the same kind of home life as you, as a probably middle class white teacher who have a certain kind of idea of family, for example. Let them show that they have different kinds of experiences. And one part of that is, I think, developing community spirit within the classroom. That again, students won't want to expose their identities to in a group where they don't feel safe or they don't feel included. And I think it might actually contribute to more challenges with the group. When you feel constantly under threat, you're going to be defensive. And that defensiveness could come out as, for example, perceived bad behavior. So asking questions about why students are acting up is important. And also from the teacher side, you know, why should the students reveal who they are, what their identities are like, if you don't first act as the role model? I think, you know, just something as simple as sharing some of your own life stories with the students of things that have happened to you is a good starting point for building trust with the students.
Great, some excellent points again, Oona. Yeah, for me, so on top of what Oona said, I mean, I definitely agree with all your suggestions, and I think they're very good. I think it's important about the assumptions, Oona. I would slightly differ a little bit. Yeah, not making assumptions, of course, is important, but it's difficult and sometimes impossible. Because by the end of the day, we are human beings. And, you know, while I'm looking at you two on the screen, the whole time I've been making assumptions about what kind of person you are. But I'm not sharing with you what's going on in my head. But I know that the assumptions that are going on in my head, although I'm a professor, I've written about this for such a long time, I'm still having assumptions about you and about what you say and so on and so forth. So, of course, yeah, we can try to avoid these assumptions, but again, maybe we are not superhumans. I think what's interesting maybe for teachers is to learn to reflect on why they make these assumptions. So for example, to have like a notebook somewhere, you know, at home or whatever, and every time when very clearly there's an assumption or assumptions that have been made about certain students in the classroom that have influenced our behaviors or the decisions that we made, then we can write about it and then try to explain to ourselves, or if we can discuss about it with others, why we're making these assumptions and how, if possible, I could try to move forward. What can I learn from this? I think that would be, you know, very much complementary to what you are saying. I think that the second point also, what's missing, but I think that's a global problem, is that we don't dare to have certain painful, hard, difficult conversations in our classrooms. Intercultural, multicultural stuff is not just Disneyland, happy, shiny, beautiful, you know, we love each other, we respect, we tolerate. This is not the real world. You know, if we go to Disneyland, that's fine. But outside Disneyland, the world is tough. People are really difficult to each other. And I think that what the pandemic has showed is that we are actually animals to each other. Already in January 2020, I had a Chinese member of my family visiting, and already at the time, he was called Corona all the time on the streets by Finnish youngsters, which I thought was quite interesting because I can imagine what the situation would have been like 5 months later, in a sense. So we need to talk about all this. You know, it's not Disneyland. We need to give tools to students to face these situations, to talk about these situations. The media are full of terrible discourses about immigrants. I mean, look at Helsingin Sanomat, how they spread terrible discourses about so-called plurilingual, whatever, you know, migrants during the pandemic. I think they are responsible for a lot of racism, although they believe they are doing good because they are informing. But no, they are selling their news, and it's meant to be a very serious. So we need to prepare the kids for this, you know, and to, you know, I know that critical media stuff is very big in Finland, but I'm not sure if it's really working. Are we really talking about these very serious issues? Racists are not just perussuomalainen. The racists are potentially any one of us, and a lot of media outlets, they spread racist discourses, which nobody would consider to be racist, but they are. So I think that teachers need to move things around and, of course, prepare the students, give them some tool to try to understand why people are. It's not about accusing anyone. Now, I've accused one newspaper because I'm tired of this newspaper that I still read every day. But, you know, who is saying, why are they saying, what are the potential consequences on my life as someone who looks different, you know, being, you know, different skin color, different whatever. I think we need this. And at the same time, discussions around how do we talk about interculturality? You know, open up all these ideas of respect, tolerance, anti-racist, culture shock. We throw all these terms all the time in our face. You know, you must respect the other. Okay, great, but how do you teach that? What does it actually mean? You know, let's talk about it. You know, ask the kids, you know, someone said something racist, for example, in the classroom or considered to be racist. How do we take this on board? I have observed some classes where teachers, they pretend they don't hear. But then I've observed classes where teachers actually take it on board, and they're not aggressive to anyone or anything. They just change the lesson plan and integrate fantastic discussions around this. And it must be done again and again and again. I think that some teachers, of course, don't feel comfortable with this. Nobody is comfortable with this kind of stuff, but this is a disease. You know, our society, Finland, like the US, like China, like everywhere, experiences this absolutely terrible disease in a sense. Yeah, please.
A couple of points. I definitely agree with what you're saying, and I think that teachers, some teachers have kind of, they perhaps see their role as, you know, my role is to teach and my role is not to be political. And for this reason, they may try to avoid having difficult conversations. But like I was saying earlier, you know, school is not safe from politics in that sense. And so that's why I do think that we need to have those difficult conversations with the students and face that discomfort. And I think it's useful to talk about our feelings at the same time. And you can say as a teacher, you know, I noticed that you said this, and it could be interpreted in this way. And I think it's a difficult issue, and we feel this, you know, just like voicing, you know, what we're feeling. But I think that we should have a discussion about it. What's also important is that teachers feel that they are receiving support from the leadership of the school as well in this issue, because you know, you always also fear these issues are not just discussions that happen in the classroom, but the children take them home, and then you have this potential for having parental sort of responses about issues as well. And so there's a lot of fear, I think, also from teachers' part for this reason to tackle the difficult issues. It's just easier to pretend it didn't happen, and then you yourself may feel terrible, but you know, somehow you weren't prepared for that comment to come out of the child's mouth when it did, or whatever it is. I think also I wanted to pick up on this question of assumptions. I like the idea that definitely you should reflect on, you know, what was my assumption there? Why did I act in the way that I did? But I also think that needs to be followed up with action, not just reflection. You know, I did a bad thing. If you realize you've done something that could harm or hurt one of your students, you need to go back and also apologize and say, listen, I've been thinking about what I said to you earlier, and I've realized for this reason, you know, that it was wrong, and I want to apologize to you. This is already, you know, doing a lot to sort of gain back a little bit of trust, and at least this relationship between you and the student, and they feel less misunderstood, and perhaps also you gain a little bit more respect for being honest and not pretending that you're somehow perfect and don't ever make mistakes. So
yeah, very good point. Yeah, very good point about the actions. Yeah, I think, yeah, having like an idea of different strategies to act upon afterwards is a good point. But, you know, I remember once I observed a class in Helsinki. It was an English class, and the teacher was teaching about fruit in English, different kinds of fruit that you find in Finland. And there was only a little black girl, sorry for referring to her color, in the classroom. And suddenly the teacher turned to her and said, oh, what about you? So what kind of fruit do African people eat? And the little girl, you know, looked very embarrassed by the question and didn't say anything. And the teacher insisted, and the little girl, well, you could see she had tears in her eyes. And at some point she screamed actually to the teacher. She said, I don't know, Ope, I've never been to Africa. And the teacher said, oh, okay. So what about others? What fruit do they eat in Africa? So basically, she didn't get the point. I spoke to the teacher afterwards, but I'm not blaming the teacher. I spoke to the teacher afterwards and I said, so do you understand what happened here? And she said, no, it's really weird because, you know, when I did my teacher education in Helsinki, they told me, seize all opportunities for including diversity in your teaching. So she said, I had this little girl there. I thought she's going to be so happy because I care about her. She said culture. I'm sorry about this word. And I said, but do you know this? And that links back to what you said earlier. She didn't seem to know that the kid actually had never been anywhere outside Finland and that she only spoke Finnish and basically, you know, did not much about other parts of the world. So the teacher was confused. You see, if I hadn't asked her that question, she would not have been able to reflect, in a sense, on this misconception that she had. So, yeah, conversations, yeah, but awareness, of course, is number one, and then action, if possible, absolutely. And the example you give is very good. And maybe to finish on that, I mean, number one, what is the real point of education? I go back to this, I'm reinventing the wheel. I'm afraid that the more I read the Finnish national core curriculum, the more I think that what we are trying to support is definitely this neoliberal system of creating workers for the future. But it's not about humanistic stuff. It's not about, you know, rethinking how we are made to think about diversity, how we are made to think about the world. And then that links up to, of course, teacher education. What do we do in teacher education? You know, in terms of how do we understand this? How do we, you know, help? Again, that's a tricky question because in Finland, it's individual based. Individual lecturers and professors can decide what they're going to teach. And they don't realize, you know, oh, now you say, oh, teachers don't like politics, but they don't realize that it is politics. Whatever I say about intercultural, multicultural as a scholar is politics. My books are politics. Your thesis will be politics, whether you like it or not. We have no choice. So maybe one thing we should do is to rethink what education is about, but also what politics is about, I think.
This has been a very interesting discussion to follow. Thank you both so much. We are coming to the end of this video, but do you perhaps have something that you would still like to add to this discussion?
Can I show these?
Yes, of
Do you
course.
mind? I think that's, yeah. Can you see those? Yeah, two rings.
Yeah.
So this one, can you see? So there's like a straight line and a ring. This one I've had for 1 year now. It's on this finger and it stands very straight there, as you can see. Well, maybe you don't see, but it's straight. And if it shifts a little bit, I can put it back there, very straight. I feel so comfortable and reassured because of this ring. This ring here that I started wearing a few days ago is really weird. I label it weird, but of course that's me labeling it. So as you can see, it's very, you know, there is a center, but the shapes are all different around. And I've been wearing it on this finger, feeling extremely annoyed all the time because I'm shifting it, trying to find the straight line like here, but there's no straight line. You can turn it around. Maybe you don't see. You can turn it around in all sides. There is no straight line to make it look straight in a sense. And I think that this is a very good symbol of what maybe teachers or scholars, researchers like us are trying to do. This is comfort. You know, we think we know what culture is. We think we know what identity is. We think we know what interculturality is. But actually, this is the reality. It changes. You can put it around, turn it. You will never find the right line to make it look good. I think that's an interesting image, actually, because we need to shift from here to here. I've had it for a few days. I really hate it because I prefer to go to this one. So this is what I should get used to in a sense. And even though, you know, Oona and I have been working on a long time on this, I think maybe we will never get used to this.
yeah, I definitely want to add on to that this idea that don't see yourself as ready or finished somehow or suddenly. I definitely feel like I have an awful lot still to learn, even though I haven't been in the field as long as Fred, but I think probably Fred also feels the same. And it's okay to start from where you are and to continue developing and to have an interest and to see that it's important. And not to be afraid of making mistakes, because nobody's perfect and humans are not perfect and teachers are not perfect. And you slowly, by taking an interest and by reflecting on your own practice, in a few years' time, or even in a few days or weeks' time, you can already start making a difference in small kind of ways to the system as well. So yeah, like your metaphor.
You're right. Nobody can say, oh, I'm ready for interculturality. I mean, the day I'm ready for interculturality is the day when I die, because I won't have to deal with human beings anymore. On this note, thank you.
Thank you, Oona and Fred. Mikäli sinua kiinnostaa tutustua aiheeseen kirjallisuuden parissa, niin minulla olisi muutama materiaalivinkki Oonalta. Eli nigerialaisen kirjailijan Chimamanda Adichien Americana tai Half of a Yellow Sun -kirjat sekä turkkilaisen kirjailijan Elif Shafakin kirjat. Ja Oona vinkkasi minulle myös sivuston, jossa listataan moninaisempaa kirjallisuutta lapsille ja nuorille. Ja linkki tälle sivustolle löytyy tuolta videon kuvauksesta. Ja jos haluat käsitellä maailmankuvaa ja sen muodostumista luokkahuoneessa, niin Taksvärkiltä löytyy myös Maailman äänet -opas. Tämä opas kannustaa tutkimaan median välittämiä tietoja, arvoja ja asenteita. Se laajentaa erilaisten medialähteiden ja harjoitusten avulla mielikuvia globaalista etelästä, haastaa ennakkoluuloja ja antaa ideoita kestävän kehityksen toimintatapojen tuomiseen luokkahuoneeseen. Linkki oppaaseen löytyy tämän videon kuvauksesta ja lisätietoja löydät Taksvärkin nettisivuilta.